Good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Powers, Executive Director at CoLabs, a consortium of federally funded research laboratories and joint institutes in Colorado. And part of our ecosystem includes research universities, technology companies, economic development organizations, and we look to enrich the fabric here in Colorado of the federally funded research entities as a resource for our state and our country when it comes to innovative technologies. Part of that mission involves sharing best practices and convening conversations like today's, where we're going to have a webinar presented by Scott Sample with Innosphere Ventures regarding taking your lab out to market. And I'm going to hand it right over. I'll talk a little bit more about CoLabs at the end. But Scott, let's get started with you.
All right. Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for attending. As Dan mentioned, I'm Scott Sample, so let me do a little brief introduction about myself, and then I'll talk just for a second about Innosphere, and then we'll dive into the main topics that we wanted to cover today. So right now, I'm the Innosphere Chief Operating Officer. I joined Innosphere about a little over 5 years ago, and I really lead the client service side, the commercialization side. In a second, you'll learn a little bit more about Innosphere, but my job together with the client managers is to support technology-based startups. My first career, though, was I spent 35 years in tech working for HP and later Agilent Technologies here in Colorado, in Loveland, on the test and measurement side, meaning the original part of HP focused on design and manufacturing tools for electrical engineers, electronic circuits. First 20 years was in marketing. The last 15 were in general management and as a vice president. So I had responsibility for product development, marketing, sales, manufacturing, really the whole piece of the P&L. And that gave me the confidence and experience to join Innosphere. Just from an educational background, I have a double E and an MBA from University of Rochester in New York. So a little bit about me, a little bit about Innosphere. So we are a nonprofit headquartered in Fort Collins, Colorado, but really servicing all of Colorado, hence the relationship with Dan and with CoLabs. Our mission is to help startups in science and tech become successful, get air under their wings, gain customers, gain funding, really establish a business out of that. There's really three parts to Innosphere: a commercialization side, a venture capital, and a facility. Our headquarters building is here in Fort Collins. That's all I'm going to say about the facility. We have a fund that actually invests in some of our startup clients. I'll talk a little bit about that today, but most of what I'm going to focus on is the commercialization and the context for how to think about the challenges of moving a technology out of federal labs into the private sector and ultimately gaining customers and sales. So maybe to wrap this slide up, we've been a nonprofit focused on this for a little over 20 years. We touch about 40 clients a year. And as I mentioned, I've been with Innosphere for about 5 years. Okay, here's the agenda. As I worked with Dan and put this together, we thought about the journey of potentially leaving federal labs with a technology and what would be the logical steps to bringing that technology to fruition and actually starting a business. So roughly speaking, that sequence would be something like the agenda: securing your IP, identifying who your target customer is, sizing that market, establishing a business model. How are you going to make money? How is this going to operate as a business? Fully developing the technology into a product or a service, pursuing funding if you need outside capital to make all this work. And then I'm going to wrap it up with a little bit about Innosphere and how various support organizations function to help startups in that sequence of events. I love to do interactive presentations. If we were all in a conference room, I'd have great eye contact, encourage questions. So what you'll find in Zoom is I will consciously pause. Oh, since we've got a handful of people, it's pretty easy to open up, come off mute, ask a question, or if you're more comfortable, just type it into chat. But I will consciously, pause to solicit questions. All right. As a famous airline captain used to say when I was flying all over the world supporting my businesses, if you don't want to go to China right now would be a great time to get off the plane. If you don't want to listen to me for the next 40 minutes or so, now would be a great time to sneak out the door. All right, so let's talk a little bit about securing IP. And I've used the abbreviation IP for intellectual property. But basically the essence is, hey, if you've got a technology and you're thinking about becoming a company, the technology is as fundamental as it sounds in terms of creating competitive advantage and differentiation. So the first thing to think about is how to secure your IP, how to think about protecting it and differentiate and using it as a differentiator from a customer point of view. And that technology most often is patents. Since we deal with science and tech startups, quite often there's an innovation and invention behind the scenes that's the basis for the company, and that's patented and protected. But it can also be things like trade secrets, copyrights, or trademarks, like quite often patents. And so if you think about protecting or an IP strategy, it's really the heart of it is identifying the IP, classifying and protecting it, and going about it in a deliberate way such that it creates competitive advantage, some unique solution for what you've invented. So as I mentioned, it can distinguish your business and its products. It can provide you protection. Quite often that can be a period of years. Another key part of developing your IP strategy is if you are going to go down the path of raising outside money from investors, it provides value in the eyes of an investor in the sense that, hey, they've invented something unique. It gives them a competitive advantage, and it in effect increases the value of the firm, hence attractive to investors. And then on the flip side, it avoids the risk of unknowingly using someone else's IP. And of course, they want to protect it, and so they can come after you. So the IP strategy, I think, is unique and is really the first step towards starting to think about forming a company and going out on your own. All right, so I just wanted to briefly touch on that, but I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this next section, and that is identifying your customer. Without a business or without a customer, you don't have a business. And
Scott,
Dan,
this is Dan.
I see you.
Could I interrupt with a question?
Absolutely.
I'm curious. Like so many questions were prompted knowing your experience and Innosphere's experience with the commercialization or otherwise the transfer of research out of the labs. How does that whole IP strategy conversation work when you're dealing with a federal employee or someone who that's the nature of the source of their technology?
Yeah, so let me give you an analogy or a comparison, and then I think we can draw some parallels to what would happen in federal labs. So I left this out of the introduction, but I'm glad we have a chance to bring it in. We have a deep relationship with School of Mines, with CU Boulder and Colorado State. And it's really because, guess what? There's innovation and invention going on in each of those organizations. Those organizations all have some degree of a tech transfer office, which as an employee of the university, the university does have rights around the IP that's been invented. And so tech transfer helps negotiate, in effect, how the university as an employer will be compensated, and ultimately how the founder is allowed to use that IP in creating a company. So given that model, as an employee in federal labs, I would encourage you to start the conversation with your immediate supervisor, ultimately the director of labs, and start to think through, okay, how would that mechanism be brought to bear? How do I gain the rights to the IP that I've invented as an employee?
Hey, Scott, this is Mark.
Yes,
So
sir.
I'm a client director. One of the clients I worked with is Longpath Technologies, who has technology out of CU and out of NIST. So the federal government is happy to license technology. They're looking to get it out into the commercial world. And so we licensed a piece of technology. It was dual comb laser technology that was developed at NIST and got a license for Longpath to deploy that in their product. So it's a process that is well documented, well understood, and it was fairly painless when we did it.
All right, perfect. Thanks for reflecting on that example.
So this is John Eisman, just one follow-up, maybe two. So I'm a tech transfer coordinator for the National Wildlife Research Center, a USDA lab up here in Fort Collins. And you know, I just got to echo what Mark said. You know, I'm also the regional representative for the Federal Laboratory Consortium. And, you know, federal laboratories are actively seeking partners to license and, you know, produce and manufacture technologies that come out of those labs. So, you know, I would encourage Innosphere to look to federal labs. I don't know what your history is working with federal labs, but it is a wonderful source of technologies that we're looking to basically give away, license. So.
Yep. John, thanks for sharing that, because that's the essence of why Dan Powers and I got together about, you know, how do we make this easier and more seamless to bring those technologies to market. All right. Any other questions around IP? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the next topic.
Let's have one more quick question. Does Innosphere help the inventors or your clients with the patenting process?
A little bit. We've got two legal firms that are partners with Innosphere, Brownstein and Fairfield and Woods, and we'll introduce the right lawyers who, you know, have spent quite a bit of time with startups. The actual submission for the patent is still on the client, but we'll guide to a certain extent.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
You bet. All right, let's move on to identifying your customers. So the next step in the process is really what in our space is called choosing product market fit. So it involves a simple set of questions that sound easy, but a lot of work needs to be done. So who's the customer of my product? Think of it this way: for what job would this customer hire my product? How is the job getting done today? Are there issues in adopting my product? And besides my product, what else does the customer need to get value from my offering? So a good example of that is, if you've invented a cell phone, do you need a network to go along with that, right? Not just the phone, but a network, cell towers, base stations, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, how does the customer buy my product? So I'm going to take you through an example, because if I reflect on the 5 years or so that I've worked at Innosphere, this is the hardest part to get right. If you get this right, the other elements of the business fall into place. The answers become apparent. If you don't get this right, almost guarantee that it'll be hard to succeed. So that series of questions leads to the concept called a value proposition. And it's sort of you can kind of think of it as a triangle that involves a customer, how they use the technology or an application, and in fact, what the product is. So think customer, product, and application. Quite often when technologies get invented, the inventor has multiple uses in mind for the technology. And we see this all the time in universities, and I suspect it can be similar with technologies coming out of federal labs. So this is meant to provide a little bit of a tool to help you think about the use cases and the customer types for an application. So think of a simple Excel, think of listing a number of different applications for the technology that might be applied to specific customers. So I chose an example. We're going to invent today a new kind of an egg beater, and just play with me on this. It's going to be called the Egg-O-Matic egg beater. And the presumption here is that you can use the egg beater for a number of different applications, making whipping cream, making souffles, cakes, or blending soup. And the users can be an amateur cook. So think home cook, somebody that just enjoys cooking for the fun of it as a hobby, that kind of thing. A short order cook. So think maybe a breakfast restaurant or a dinner restaurant. And then commercial baker. So 3 very different users across 4 different applications. And then the exercise is to think about rating the value of our product, the Egg-O-Matic egg beater, across each of those cells. So in other words, a commercial baker using the Egg-O-Matic for whipping cream, super high value, saves time, saves money. Amateur cook making souffles, egg beaters put air into it, doesn't make sense, very low value. So you start to do some interviews and maybe think about this, and you make a choice that, hey, the best case for my technology is a commercial baker saving time, has the highest value, making cakes, making whipping cream. And so from there, you can put together an at least attempt at a value proposition. So this is the slide I just showed a few minutes ago. So I'm going to go after cooks with my egg beater, cooks that are baking a cake, and my value proposition is saving time and energy. So while I use sort of an easy to understand example, for some of the technologies that we see coming out of universities and presumably out of federal labs, this is not an easy exercise to go through. It often quite involves a lot of dialogue with potential customers. Some become a fit, some don't, and sort of the courage to figure out where is the best match, where is the highest value proposition. And so what we end up taking our clients through is this thing called a positioning statement. And a positioning statement looks a little bit like this. For a particular target user who has this kind of problem, my product provides this kind of benefit as opposed to alternative solutions. And so what does that look like for the Egg-O-Matic? It looks like this. For cooks who want to bake cakes, the Egg-O-Matic is an egg beater that dramatically saves time and energy. Unlike beating eggs with a whisk, our product automates and simplifies egg beating. And so you save time and energy. So again, simple example, very, very important concept to get right. All right, let me pause again. Questions about customer discovery, product market fit, figuring out how to shape your technology to solve a real problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Scott, this is Dan. I am curious, since you referenced sometimes the technology coming out of labs or the universities can be quite complex. What tends to be a sort of a holdup or a sticking point when you're in that process with something that's highly technical?
Yeah, so there's two challenges. A lot of the innovation, a lot of the innovators that we see struggle with the idea of focusing. So imagine inventing a technology and you see multiple uses. It's sort of hard to sort of really commit to a particular spot. And that's a challenge. I had product development people underneath me at HP, and forever they would say, well, you know, I've designed this new mouse. It can be used for X, Y, and Z. And I've said, hey, have you talked to any customers? And so the second challenge is actually getting time in front of customers. And customers can tell you, well, you know, I'm already using a mouse. Yours is too small. It's too big. It's not responsive enough. I don't like the color. And so that fear of rejection around something that you've put your heart and soul into developing can be tough. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you don't have customers, you don't have a business. So I would say two things: the art of focusing and figuring out where, and the logistics and tactical scheduling issues with talking to customers and listening to their feedback. Both are challenges.
Hey, Scott, I have a question for you. So sometimes, let's say in a federal laboratory, the invention is for a very specific purpose. There may not be a large market to it, but at times, not frequently, but there have been some significant examples where having a broader audience to speak to actually can pivot that technology to other uses. And so therefore, you really don't know what your actual markets might be sometimes. And helping the inventors and the agency is a useful thing, but you don't have a broad enough network to do so.
Yep. I'm going to talk a little bit about sizing, but when I hit that, let me kind of expand that around how to sort of poke in on multiple markets and find kind of the sweet spot.
Okay, thanks.
I was going to echo that on behalf of NOAA as well, just to say that so frequently the inventions that we see coming out of our labs are very specific and designed for a very specific purpose. So the challenge has always been trying to expand the thinking about what the invention could possibly be used for that's outside of the laboratory function that we have. And a lot of times that's good enough. The laboratory function is good on its own, but it's good to get more options too.
And we see some of that with universities too. On the other side, there are corporates, meaning corporations, that are out hunting for technologies to add to their portfolio. And so still the conundrum is, you know, how do I as an inventor learn about all possibilities? How do I as a corporation learn about all possibilities? How do you create sort of enough awareness to get a good match? But yes, challenging.
You know, just one last comment on that, kind of echoing what Larry said, is that, you know, our scientists may be inventors, but they're not entrepreneurs. You know, our federal scientists, you know, they draw a paycheck, they get their grade increases and salary increases from publication history. There very, very few of them have that entrepreneurial mindset. And so that's a challenge from the federal lab perspective, is we may not be developing that invention for the inventors to take out to a business. You know, we're looking for somebody else to do that, work with scientists to refine it. So.
Yeah, and John, quite often what we see is a client company will come in and it's headed up by the inventor who hasn't ever taken a company, you know, through this maturity phase, or run a company. And so what we'll often do is help them find, we call it a business driver, but in effect, it's a partner who maybe has the marketing, sales, operational skills, has maybe raised money, while the inventor then takes on a role of like a chief technology officer, not necessarily a CEO or a president.
Yeah.
That can be a long dating period sometimes, right? Because both sides have to feel comfortable with it. The new person coming in, as well as the founder inventor. But yeah, some of the best marriages, or some of the best founders that come out of innovation realize that they don't have the skills and are willing to partner with somebody that does. And then you kind of get the best of both. All right, let's talk about sizing. So the goal of sizing the market is really to confirm that there's enough there to justify pursuit of a business. You know, is it bigger than a niche? How big is it? How much can I grow it? And there's really two kind of ways to sort of figure that out. One is called primary research, and one is called secondary research. The research is designed to answer questions like, who has the need for this? Who can afford it? In other words, does it have a high enough value proposition to justify the payment or the price? How many people exist, you know, to buy this? How much money is currently being spent to solve that problem? And then who do I compete with in this market? So all of these things kind of roll together to determine the size of the market. So the goal on, let's see, I think I went backwards. Hang on here for a sec. Yep. All right, so I mentioned two types of research. Primary market research is really warranted early on because I think it was John's comment, hey, there can be pivots along the way. And so the best way to figure that out is primary research. It's actually conversations, interviews, talking to people at shows, at technical events, things like that. But really trying to understand, hey, how is this problem solved today? Is my technology a better solution? How would that be used? How would you adopt that? Those would be great examples of questions in an interview that falls under this umbrella of primary market research. Once you have that, maybe you can think about some secondary market research to think through, well, who else has looked at this? How big is it? Are there any public surveys or public data that exists? A great place to go is actually the public library. And in fact, Fort Collins has I'll kind of skip to the bottom of this and then cover the rest, but Fort Collins has a business librarian who's really, really skilled. And in fact, so skilled, she was recognized as #1 in the United States for helping companies shape research and investigate some of these same questions. You know, is the market big enough? Who are the competitors? That kind of thing. But anyway, coming back to the main title, sources for secondary research can include trade associations, scientific groups. Quite often the government publishes quite a bit of invaluable information, and then third-party research like a Frost and Sullivan or IBIS. You know, there's various third parties out there that track certain industries, certain technologies, certain solutions. So not an easy thing to do, but it's kind of a combination of curiosity, detective work, and interviewing skills to try to shape the size of the market. Okay, make sense?
Scott, I have a question. This is Dan.
Sure.
Regarding that market shaping, what become the statistics or the metrics that you end up discerning?
Yeah, great idea, or a great question. So generally what you want to be able to say at some point, and this is particularly critical for the early investors, is look, I think I can sell X number of these per year at Y price, which creates a revenue goal for the company, and compare that against the possible total spending in that market. So maybe think of it this way. I don't know what the volume is of egg beaters today. Let's just call it $100 million worth of egg beaters get sold. And now I've invented something that is fundamentally better than the existing egg beater. You got to be able to say at some point, hey, look, I think I can capture 25% or 50% or 10% of the existing egg beater market because mine is smaller, faster, cheaper, more powerful, spins better, uses less time, whatever that value proposition is. And if those numbers hold together, is it big enough to create to attract the investment to ultimately, fund the company and create value? So there's a financial play behind sort of this sizing to see if, in effect, the numbers hold together. Does that answer, Dan?
Sure. Thank you very much.
All right, so just to recap where we're at right now, you've secured your IP, you developed an IP strategy, the IP creates some kind of competitive advantage, you've chosen a target customer and worked through the value proposition, you're convinced you can attack this market because it's big enough and that it will support a business. That's sort of what we've walked through so far. All right. So then that begs the question, what else do you have to do? Well, there's a little bit more. I want to tee up the conversation around a business model. So business model, in its simplest definition, is an array of choices built around customer value proposition. Remember a few minutes ago, I said, this is the part that's the hardest. Get the value proposition right. Okay. And this is an example of, if you get it right, it'll lead you to the business model that in effect delivers value and earns a profit. When I joined HP, Dave Packard was still a force in the company. This was in the late 70s. And at the time, I remember him giving a speech and he said, look, if you're not making a profit, you're not providing enough value to your customers. So rather than think of profit as the nasty outcome of nefarious businesses, think of profit as a reflection of how much value you supply. And I carried that notion around in my career for a long time, especially as people invented products that didn't make a profit. And you could look at them and say, well, you must not be supplying enough value if you can't make a profit. So the essence of business model is, how do you make a profit? And the most important thing in that is to establish a customer value that's high enough to allow the cost structure to exist underneath. So we've covered a little bit of this already, but you got to understand and know how to access the customer, know what job they want to hire you for, what job they're willing to pay, and have that initial product offering be able to make a profit. So that's sort of the first element in the business model. The other three elements kind of fall out of that if you think about it, but they're the notion of what is the profit formula, meaning revenue, costs, margin, cash flow. So all financial. What are the resources that the company needs to bring to bear to pull off delivering that product, delivering that solution? So certainly people are a resource, cash is a resource, the technology and product development that you bring, and then any partnerships. You might partner with a dealer or distributor to fulfill orders. You might partner with a marketing firm to create awareness and demand. And then the last part of the business model is the processes involved sort of under the hood. How does the company actually work? How do you hire people? How do you create sales? How do you do a product roadmap? And how do you take care of the financials? Most of what we see are business models that are built on IP, and that's why I started with IP. And so this is a great Harvard Business Review model that we adopted And it really outlines 4 possible business models. But the most common one that we deal with, being in science and tech and being in innovation, is what's called build a moat and collaborate. And so build a moat means you've really got some strong IP, you've made a fundamental contribution in a technology, and the moat is, think of a castle on a hill surrounded by a moat. Very, very difficult for competitors to attack that because you have a fundamental advantage. And then you can use collaboration for things like sales or marketing strategies. Maybe you hire a contract manufacturer and collaborate with them to build it. But the core part of the business, the castle on the hill, is surrounded by something that's difficult to attack, a moat. That's in effect what this model tries to point out. All right, another good pause point. Make sense on the business model? All right, then let's go on to developing your technology. Okay, this is probably the second hardest thing. Once you've got a customer and you've got IP, developing your technology is a process. This next set of slides, I'm going to give a shout out to Osvaldo. He is one of our trusted advisors, runs a bit of a consulting business to help technology innovators develop products. That's been his career, long and successful career. And so I'm shamelessly ripping off his slides. He gave me permission. I really like the way he thinks about it. And so that's why I wanted to share it with you guys. The way that Osvaldo thinks about going from technology to product is a little bit like this layer model, where the core IP has been developed, but then you need to think about the next layer out. He calls it wrapping. The next layer out after that, support and commerce. I'm just going to talk about how to get from core to the wrapping, but the wrapping really takes the core IP and turns it into a product. So think about a cell phone. The core IP is how to connect to the network, how to do duplex communication, how to stay connected as you're zooming down the highway, as handoffs happen between cell towers. The wrapping is things like the reliability, the case, the choice of the glass, how much memory to include for apps. So certainly important parts of a cell phone, but not necessarily the core IP. So here's a great way to think of moving from that inside core to the outside layers. You go through a research phase, a development phase, and then finally an execution. You can think of this as a instantiation of various levels of technical readiness, right? TR level 2 to 3 to 4 to 6 to 7 to 8. But the key, I think, in terms of stepping out of a federal lab and starting to form a company is really this research phase transitioning into development phase. And so in the research phase, you may be wrapped into the notion of customer discovery, like we talked about earlier, around value proposition, target segment, where could that technology be used? You may be fundamentally in this loop between idea generation, investigation, brainstorming, and idea selection. Not uncommon for raw technology to sit in that research phase for a while, doing that loop, until you really have the eureka moment and say, hey, this technology is ideally suited for this problem, creating this value proposition. Now I need to go into development phase and fully create the product or the solution. You know, I need to put the screen around it. I need to put the user interface in place. I need to have a hard shell case, whatever those issues are. So think about research phase as being tied really intimately into the customer and customer segments and the choices you're making around a business. And think of the development phase as the next sort of phase in terms of bringing the product to market. And so this is maybe another way to think about it, going from IP to MVP, minimum viable product, developing from a proof of concept to a prototype that you could actually put in somebody's hands, to a pilot, and maybe multiple customers have it, and then ultimately to launching it as off the shelf and commercially viable. If you look at that in a timeline, maybe in the research phase, there's really just one person, the tech expert, but as you get into the development phase, you may have to bring in more help, somebody that really knows, let's say, user design, somebody that really knows providing the physical packaging and having that withstand shock, vibration, temperature, somebody that knows how to put it in a box and protect it for shipment. And so it sort of blossoms into more and more specialties by the time you fully develop it and fully move it into the market. But I wanted to give you just enough of an outlook of, hey, how do you take this core IP and actually get it to market? All right.
Scott, this is Dan. Can I ask a question?
Yep.
It's sort of a big picture occurring to me. Could you go back 2 slides when you were showing the core R&D? You were describing, yes, how that often, or one, yes, that one. Often the core research phase and idea selection, you could stay in there for a while.
Yep.
And for many of the attendees on the call, they could probably answer this even more directly, but I'm curious if you're in more of a basic research or just ongoing research setting, the problems to be solved out in the quote real world, are they being considered when you are researching, or is it that there's some sort of outside prompt that almost comes in between these 2 phases? There's someone or some entity that plays the role of being aware of what research is happening and has a sense of what's possible in terms of a market and even a problem to be solved. And that seems like there's almost an additional challenge, is just the mindset of people who are on the R&D side being able to conceptualize their research as an actual solution to something, at least one that would be commercializable. And so there's not really a question there as much as I'm curious if particularly people on the call see the challenge of the research is happening, but it's not necessarily with a specific problem to be solved as much as just revelations to be uncovered.
Yeah. Anyone want to comment on that?
This is John. I'll comment on it because I'll just kind of reference a model that we use in our federal lab, and that is, between investigation and validation, we have another box in there that is identifying partners, private partners, to work with us to bridge that gap, because that's the hardest gap for us, as with any technology, I think. But so that's how we would handle that. Is, we can handle the research phase. We may need some outside support for that, or some expertise outside to help with that. But that chasm between your development phase and the research phase is where we actively seek partners to help us bridge it.
And John, I assume by what you said, those partners are acting somewhat like customers, telling you, hey, it would be a better technology if it really nailed this problem, or you're going to compete over here, do this better. They're providing you, in effect, that customer discovery feedback loop. Is that fair?
Yeah, in most instances, yeah. Not always. It depends upon who you're working with, but that's pretty accurate. Because again, going back to the mindset of the scientist, they don't necessarily think about that entrepreneurial aspect. They think about the research and meeting our mission needs.
Yeah, exactly. And I suspect many of them are listening to the feedback and in parallel processing on, well, how would I tune up the gain on that? Or how would I make that more reliable? Or how would I make that more repeatable? Or how could I get that to operate in an environment that I didn't expect, right? All of those kind of questions.
Well, I think the latter is a really important one, is not necessarily how to operate within that environment, but what else can I do with this idea
Right.
that makes it even more attractive?
Okay,
Well, thank you, guys.
very good. All right, let's cover funding, and then we're going to put a wrapper around it. So two types of funding to think about, non-dilutive and dilutive. The earliest stage companies often pursue grants, meaning non-dilutive funding. And what that really means is it's free money. There's no other way to describe it. In other words, the granting organizations don't have an ownership position in the company. So here in Colorado, we have some great programs sponsored by OEDIT called Advanced Industry Grants. But of course, you guys know federal agencies are often funding breakthroughs in technology. Could be National Science, Institute of Health, DOD, DOE. So quite often in our earliest clients, they are heavy into researching who's interested, how do I do a grant proposal, how do I win the grant, and all in the spirit of not diluting the ownership of the company. At some stage, though, most companies will go and look at dilutive outside money, and it can either be in the form of debt, meaning I owe you that money back, or equity, meaning now you're part ownership. There's a whole set of grants, advanced industry grants, kind of two kinds. Some require matching, some don't. I just included this slide as a point of reference. But here's sort of the sequence of outside capital. You might have heard angel investors, micro venture capital, family office, super angels. Most companies sort of proceed from the bottom, founder funding, non-dilutive ahead of that, to pre-seed, seed, growth capital, and later stage. A big part of what Innosphere does is help companies think through this sequence of raising money as it impacts their core business strategy, all the way from the invention, target customer, go-to-market strategy, how fast they can get to market and raise revenue. So not a trivial process, fair amount of financial math behind trying to pull this off. But as you can imagine too, it's somewhat of a sales process, right? The more investors you talk to, the higher chance you're going to get funded and raise money. So not for the faint of heart. And quite often our innovation founders struggle with this, and it's a good reason, again, to seek out help from some organization like Innosphere, or to seek out a partner that's done this before. In other words, a CEO. So significant questions to ask when you first start raising money. How much do I need? How do I find investors? How do I identify and communicate the risk for investors? Because remember, these investors have multiple things they can invest in, right? They could buy a building and create cash flow. They could buy stocks. They could open a trust and do philanthropy, donations into the community, or they can invest in your company. And so if you step back and think about, you're competing for their hard-earned money, how do you make it attractive? We see investors that only want to go in healthcare because they've got a history there. They want to help shape, the health well-being of the population. Aren't at all interested in other areas of investment. So continuing down the list, is it a compelling investment versus alternatives? And then what's the actual deal structure and how do I make money? Quite often we use this as a good way to think about how investors evaluate startups. They sort of process along this wheel. They look at the team, the technology, is that of interest? Is the market ready? And is capital available? And at any given point, one or two of those four areas may be the weakest part of the startup. And so we encourage our startups to always think about this as a ongoing, continuous process of risk reduction as the company matures over time, right? The technology turns into a product. The market goes from, let's say, early sales to a growth phase. I start to build out my team and add expertise in each of the functional areas. So kind of a good model to think about how to advance the state of the startup. So again, just to recap, now you've identified a business model and developed the product and raised capital. And that begs the next question, do you need help? And what kind of support organizations are out there? Well, certainly Innosphere for Science and Tech in Colorado is well recognized. We have a venture capital, as I mentioned earlier, but and in addition to that, a commercialization program. When you join Innosphere, let me cover this. So the reason startups fail, primarily market need, out of cash, or incomplete team. And so from this morning, you saw me touch on multiple or each of those areas to a certain extent, right? The reason I started with value proposition and getting customer discovery and all of that right is that no market need is really, really critical. If you solve that, you've got a much better chance of success. So when client companies come in, we introduce them to a client manager. We help them get ready for investment. We can connect them with other founders to add talent. We can introduce them to corporations that might be interested in their technology. Quite often, startups get sold to bigger companies. That's called an exit. And we can work through the sort of the financials around an exit strategy. And then we can also help them accelerate top line sales growth. And this wasn't meant to be a commercial to apply now. It's just a screenshot. But really, our mission is to accelerate the success of high impact science and tech, give them the best chance that they can for success. So Dan, I was consciously watching the clock, and I know those last few slides probably were a little bit quick, but I wanted to be true to the 10 to 11 piece. So I'll turn it back to you if we want to entertain a few more questions, or you want to talk a little bit about collabs.
Thank you, Scott. Yes, well, thank you everyone for taking this hour here. There's a lot of really good information. I have additional questions that I thought I'd save till the end. But before we wrap up, I just wanted to reference how collabs, for many of you know, a lot of our activity involved on-site lab tours. COVID took that away, and there is not imminent visitation possibilities. So doing things online is how we're going to continue to do our outreach and our fabric building here in Colorado's research ecosystem. If you have topics that you would like for us to convene and have these type of presentations on, please reach me and we're happy to arrange those. In fact, online gatherings have become much more frequent over the course of the last 8-10 months now. And you can reach me at dan@collabs, that's co-labs.org. And thank you. I see Scott has put his email down there in the chat function as well.
Yep. And I really appreciate, just to pile on to Dan's comments, I really appreciate the interactiveness. That's far more fun for me as a presenter, and great questions, great reflection. And if you do want to reach out, it's scott@innosphereventures.org. The org part is the key piece.
Thanks. And also I'm going to, this has been recorded. We're going to make this available on our YouTube channel and through other social media feeds. I'll send a direct link to all of you who had RSVP'd for this so you could watch it again or share it as you see fit. And I'll stop the recording. However, we can stay online here if people have additional questions. There are a couple I wanted to ask, but I'll wrap this up formally at an hour. And thanks, Martin. I noticed that link you sent into the report from the Department of Energy on ARPA. That is, I think I saw an announcement from DOE on that recently, and that is a good article to check out. So let's end this formally. I'll stop the recording, but we can continue the conversation if you have additional questions or resources you'd like to share with us. Thanks, Scott, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dan.